Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian. COVID has taught us a lot about the nature of science and certainly its importance. Basic science research is crucial to bring us hope and better life on the horizon. In a recent conversation with Maria Leptin, president of the European Research Council, she told me that her organization has been focusing on the well-funded critical research. Meanwhile, as she is working with scientists all over the world almost every day, she also emphasized on cooperation among scientific communities all over the world, despite the harsh realities of economic fragmentation and geopolitical competition in some parts of the world. Take a look. Professor Leptin, what a pleasure to see you here.
Yes, I'm pleased to be here too. It's always very exciting.
I'm happy to have an outstanding lady to be the head of the European Research Council. Tell me more about, when the world is changing so fast, how are you adjusting your plan for research, especially basic research?
So, of course, we don't adjust our plan. Because the plan
I like that answer.
The plan is that the scientists who we fund, they decide what they do. It's really entirely bottom up. And so we make we give no programs, we set no priorities. But we trust the scientists who apply to us to know what is the most important topic to work on. And when they get the funding, they're free to use it in whatever way they deem most appropriate. I mean, they make a proposal, but of course they have to be flexible. And we've seen that that works. So 2 of the COVID vaccines were developed by researchers who'd previously been funded by the ERC.
Are you proud of that?
We're very proud of that. We're also proud of the Nobel Prize winners who were previously funded by the ERC. So we think that works best. The scientists know best, so give them the money and the freedom, give the best ones of them the money and the freedom to do what they think is right.
But that's not easy. Here comes the governance, right? You are doing this job. So how would you make sure when you have different pressures coming from all sides saying, oh, you should do this, you should do that?
So of course we're quite young. We're 15 years old. We celebrated, well now 16. So we're coming of age, as it were. It was not clear that the experiment that the European Union set up 16, 17 years ago would work. It did work. Why does it work? The reason it works is probably because of the very tough selection. So the ERC relies on selection panels made up of international experts from all over the world, whose remit it is simply to determine which are the best proposals. So that works, and we're not going to change that. Now, of course, there are things, we have a scientific council that sets the strategy. Of course, the scientific council doesn't sit there and twiddle their thumbs. They think deeply about what's needed. So we think about research assessment. We think about which cohort of candidates should be, how the distribution of the funds should be made. Should there be collaborative projects or not? What should we do with international collaboration? So we do decide on those things, but really the core is the selection for excellence.
I love that, but on the other hand, you see the world's changing. It is a reality.
Yes.
And people are talking about the problems of economic fragmentation,
yes,
of society fragmentation, and people are also worried about so-called science fragmentation.
Yes.
And how do you see, on the one hand, there's a danger of fragmentation, on the other hand, it could be good to have some competition?
Research is competitive. Frontier research is competitive. If you're at the frontier of something, you want to be first to enter new territory. If you discover something that someone else has discovered before, it's no longer discovery. So there is competition in science, and it's good because it keeps us on our toes, it gets us excited. People are competitive by nature. Children are competitive. So we rely on that. Scientists also know that while they're fighting to be first, there's a lot of knowledge out there, and often fighting together is better. So that's where collaboration comes in. And but I think there's a lot of sort of self-regulation among scientists.
Tell me more about that.
Well, in the sense that somebody who only exploits, who does not respect others, who steals knowledge, will be cut off from the sources of knowledge. So there's a culture of interaction. Differs in different fields, but there's some self-regulation. In my experience, I've had 40 years of experience in research. That works. And so, of course, we do demand that the researchers we fund abide by ethical principles, absolutely, open science, sharing of data. So that's what we do.
Do you see it getting ever more complicated as a result of many realities?
Well, yes, things are getting more complicated as we advance research.
There's geopolitics, there is the economic recession about the funding, they could all be problematic in the future.
We will have to convince politicians, but all of us have to do that, to recognize the value of fundamental science. And of course, there's so many examples that show that value. The last was, of course, COVID. And as I've already mentioned, there's a clear illustration that the fundamental research is needed for society to adapt to new problems.
From a scientist's perspective, we see the quote-unquote ultimate authority, quote-unquote, ultimate authority of science has been challenged over the past few years. Some are misinformation and fake news against the science. Others are showing that there are limits about what we know about the world.
Yes. I think the fake news problem is not specific to science, as we know. It's we've seen it everywhere. We've seen it about elections. We've seen it everywhere. So I don't think we need to address that. What has been a problem is that scientists who were asked at the beginning of the pandemic, and I don't want to be them, they had a really hard time.
And they are continuing to have a hard time
Yes,
right now.
it's partly because we as scientists know that when we say we know something, it means we know it now. And when we say this, it's to the best of our knowledge, with a certain degree of uncertainty. And that's hard to understand for people who haven't been trained in science. And if, one scientist says A today, and the next one says 2 weeks later, well, but B, how can they trust them? What needs to be understood is that is part of science. We do it to the best of our knowledge. We can never be 100% certain. So I think that aspect was missed.
Do you see there's something called the relative truth, quote unquote? There are a lot of people talking about that, so-called relative science or relative truth.
It's semantic. It's semantic. The scientific method is something that I deeply believe in. Yeah. It's something that works. It's something that defines the way we argue. You test, you have a hypothesis, you test it, and you look at the evidence. And that's different from belief. That's evidence-based thinking.
Madam President, another question about international cooperation. Yes. I know ERC has been having 15 years great tradition of working with your partners around the world. How would you choose your priorities in terms of international cooperation? Once again, I have to mention about the reality is getting ever more complicated as a result of current affairs. So how do you make sure that scientists can still have the space to be able to work together?
Yeah, well, I think cooperation is essential for research. There is no national science. We exchange knowledge. We have to exchange knowledge. All cooperation has to depend to some degree on trust. Like I said to you before, scientists with each other. We trust some of our colleagues. Right. We don't trust others so much. And I think with global cooperation, that's the same.
How is the trust being built?
By openness on both sides and by nobody cheating, by nobody stealing. That's how, trust between nations is built in the same way as trust
Do you see sometimes it's also a communication issue, the rhetorics that we are seeing in our world today?
Of course, different nations, different cultures, but we all know the world, the earth is finite. We know each other quite well, and so I think we understand each other's cultures.
To a certain extent.
To a certain extent, and I think that does enter the equation.
We are seeing over the past few years Europe on its way to see more of its own identity. So how do you see your role as the head of the European Research Council going with that trend at this moment?
Well, I think what Europe declared a long time ago, 20 years ago, that it wanted to establish the European Research Area and that countries should increase their funding to at least 3%, hasn't happened. So I tried to tell Europe, you must do that. You know, China puts more funding into research than Europe does. US puts more in. So if Europe thinks they want to lead, then they'd better ramp up. So I see my role as reminding Europe, both at the European level and at the various national levels, that that's important. If we want to have an identity in research, we must invest.
Madam President, it's always a pleasure to see you, and congratulations for 15 years of achievements of European Research Council. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure talking to you.